you're losing time because you're always stuck in your head overthinking, when in reality that stuff doesn't even really matter and the other person may not have even thought twice about what you said. Hi, welcome back to your regularly scheduled self-reflection. I'm Tash. This is Things We Say in Therapy, a place to feel seen and heard and to learn new things. You'll hear a blend of psychological insight as well as my own personal stories, usually surrounding the more unspoken sides of mental health, things that I don't hear about very much that I think are important to speak about. If this information speaks to your experience, that's amazing. I'm so happy you're here. If not, I hope it's valuable for you in the future. Everyone's story is different and that's completely fine. So on to today's topic. Today we're going to be talking about moral perfectionism. Do you ever feel guilty as if you're not doing enough despite doing your best to be a good person? Do you ever excessively worry about being perceived as doing something wrong or as a bad person? If you are, you might be struggling with moral perfectionism. I did not know that moral perfectionism was a thing until recently, and I am so guilty. It's low-key controlled my life for a while. I am now working on it, so I think it's a valuable thing to be speaking about. Moral perfectionism can lead to depression and anxiety, to burnout, existential dread, and particularly hypervigilance. So let's move on to what moral perfectionism is. So moral perfectionism differs from general perfectionism. I'm sure you've heard the term perfectionism before. Perfectionism usually refers to being hypervigilant about tasks and wanting to complete things perfectly to the point where you're, excessively going over things, worried about submitting assignments because you want it to be perfect. Moral perfectionism is the same idea, but it's applied to your ethical standards for yourself and sometimes for others. But moral perfectionism is essentially trying to maintain a character that is perfectly good all the time, that is ethical and moral with a consistent standard, and you're terrified of being perceived otherwise. It's usually driven by a fear of judgment or moral failure. People who struggle with moral perfectionism usually have a deep discomfort with moral ambiguity and moral imperfection. If you feel like you've done something wrong, this feeling of intense anxiety encroaches and you feel like a terrible person, and it only takes one perceived moral failure to feel this way. So I wanted to speak a little bit about how moral perfectionism is born, how you begin to start feeling this way. And like most adult behaviors, it can be born from childhood experiences. The most significant one in this circumstance would probably be if you had a childhood where there were strict moral codes in the household, or if your parents had a lot of rules for you growing up, and if you deviated from those rules, then you were punished or given the silent treatment or made to feel like you were bad. It could also be born if your parents had conditional love for you. So if their love for you and affection was dependent on whether you had caused them issues or caused them an inconvenience, which, by the way, it is normal for a child to inconvenience their parent. That's the whole point of being a parent. It is abnormal for parents not to go out of their way for their child. The second reason you could become a moral perfectionist is from cultural or social influences, either from childhood, from the household you grew up in, or a continuous thing throughout your life. This could be things like purity culture, God-fearing, and extreme accountability that can come from the pressure to confess everything through fear of sinning. And you're consistently worried that something you've done, like even your thoughts, could be perceived as a sin. And so you are hypervigilant towards your behaviors and your thoughts, and you feel like you have to take responsibility for all of that, or you'll be a bad person in God's eyes or your parents' eyes, or whatever the circumstances may be. So if you're unsure what purity culture is, I'm just going to read out a definition. So purity culture is a religious movement primarily within the evangelical Christianity that emphasizes sexual abstinence and modesty before marriage, often leading to shame around sexual desire and harmful psychological impacts like anxiety and trauma, particularly for women who are taught that their virginity is a gift for their future husband. So, as you can get from that definition, purity culture can sometimes foster the desire for a flawless ethical track record, and a similar thing to what I just said about being hypervigilant about your thoughts. If you're having sexual desires, which is completely normal by the way, then you feel guilty about it and you feel the need to confess and talk about it and get rid of it. So as humans, that purity is biologically unattainable. So if you slightly deviate from these strict ethical rules, then you feel extreme guilt and you feel impure and wrong because you've been taught that purity is your worth, and you feel like you let yourself down, your parents down, your future husband down, your church down. And it can be really, really traumatizing for people who go through this. Another reason for moral perfectionism, a bit more of a modern one from a social perspective, is obviously social media. So obviously right now, cancel culture is strife upon social media, and it can cause a lot of anxiety around putting yourself out there because authenticity can be punished and put under extreme scrutiny. I personally am not a fan of cancel culture unless obviously there is a massive moral issue with someone who has a big platform who shouldn't have that platform. I do think that it can become very over scrutinizing for people who make mistakes online, and it can breed a lot of anxiety. I know I have a lot of anxiety around that as well, because people can get very intense, and so it can cause people to become hypervigilant about what they say. And again, I do think that it can be warranted for people who have been found out to be, not good people. I think that's fair, but I think that recently a lot of the time people are over scrutinized for smaller things, and that can breed a lot of perfectionism in terms of putting your opinion out there and wanting people to view you as a morally perfect person. Back to psychology. Moral perfectionism can also be born from intense trauma. It could be an attempt to control your morality due to shame about who you are, or if you have a perceived lack of control of your environment, if you are worried about things going wrong a lot and you have intense anxiety due to complex post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever it may be, you might view having a flawless moral track record to be controlling your environment, to make sure nothing's going to go wrong, to make sure that no one's going to criticize you or judge you. It's an attempt to stay safe from judgment if you've been bullied in the past or something similar. It's an attempt to control your surroundings. It's an attempt to receive acceptance from everybody around you and to help boost your self-worth. So let's talk about the reality of how this actually shows up in your life. If you have persistent moral perfectionism, this can cause chronic guilt and self-doubt and a lack of self-trust when it comes to decisions, when it comes to what you want from life, where you want to go, who you want to be. You're constantly asking yourself, was this the right thing to do? Second guessing yourself. And if you find, the slightest little reason as to why you may have made the wrong decision, or guilt for wanting to do something that doesn't necessarily fit the standard norm of things, if you feel like you've let other people down because of it, if you're not following what other people think you should do, then you feel guilt about that because your ultimate goal is to be perceived as a good person and to please other people. A big one in moral perfectionism is hyper accountability. I briefly mentioned this just before when I was talking about the religious aspects, but hyper accountability is essentially the idea that people feel an excessive amount of accountability for their actions, for their emotions, for their feelings, and often as well the actions and emotions of other people. It's an intense and often unrealistic and exaggerated need to be overly accountable and completely and utterly accountable, to never make a mistake, to never hurt somebody, to never cause discomfort for anybody, even if it's unintentional, even if your intentions weren't to hurt somebody. If you do, it's a huge problem, and it's a massive cross on your morality track record, and you feel like you're a bad person, and it's very black and white thinking. Perfectionism can also cause overthinking of the ethics of everyday actions. If you're just having a normal casual conversation with somebody and you say something that you think might have been perceived as rude or mean, even if the other person hasn't said anything about it or given off any kind of indication that they may have taken it that way, you start to overthink those things, and it breeds a lack of presence. You're losing time because you're always stuck in your head overthinking all of these tiny little things, when in reality that stuff doesn't even really matter, and the other person may not have even thought twice about what you said, but it's unrealistic. You grab onto this very minuscule thing and run with it, which is what can cause the burnout. It's exhausting mentally. Something else it causes is an inability to properly rest or to be compassionate with yourself and feel good about who you are. Because you're constantly second guessing every single decision, you don't really know who you are because you're always thinking about other people. You're never present, so you're not really making worthwhile decisions in your life. You're never able to give yourself a break. You're never able to switch your brain off, and you never truly get rest, again leading to burnout because you never truly let yourself just relax. You're constantly thinking, constantly wondering, constantly second guessing. It can also cause you to harshly judge other people as well as yourself. You may, if you're holding yourself to these moral standards, you may also unintentionally be holding other people to those standards that you've written for yourself that are quite unrealistic. And it can cause a strain on relationships if it's left unchecked, because those other people may not think the same way that you do. It can be quite exhausting for other people as well around you, because they feel like they're walking on eggshells. They feel like they're always being judged because you're judging them off your own moral code that's unrealistic and excessive. The last significant thing that moral perfectionism can cause that I've got written down is the constant fear of judgment from others and hypervigilance of how other people treat you. Because you constantly are holding yourself to this high moral standard and you constantly need to be perceived as doing good, being good, it can cause things like decision paralysis, because you're so caught up in which decision is going to be best in terms of whether people are going to consider you as good as possible. It can cause you to panic and delay your decision-making process. It can also cause you to dull down your own personality traits and who you actually are in order to fit into the mold of what you think other people would perceive as ethically sound and morally sound. You end up being quite inauthentic because you haven't truly explored who you are, what you want, making decisions that you think are right, never being the one to put their opinion and their input out there because you want to make sure that it sort of fits in with what other people would think is the moral standard. So as a little summary, moral perfectionism can cause intense, constant anxiety, depressive episodes or major depression, a lack of authenticity within yourself, a lack of presence, not being happy with who you are. It can cause a strain on your close relationships. It breeds an inability to actually enjoy life just because you're constantly in your head and you're stuck in the performance of it all and needing to be seen a certain way. You aren't able to make peace with being a human that makes mistakes. So let's get into the good bit. How do we stop being like this? I feel like there's a spectrum to this. I feel like you can have quite intense moral perfectionism, or you can sort of just maybe overthink your decisions from an ethical standpoint just a bit, that it kind of controls your mind, not as much as someone who is extremely hypervigilant and hyper accountable, but it can be sort of there a little bit. I feel like these tips can help you even if you've just got it a little bit. A lot of them are like affirmations, so let's go. Number 1, Good does not equal perfect. We are humans and we're allowed to make mistakes and still be worthy of love, still be worthy of self-compassion, still be worthy of a good life. Making mistakes does not define your character. How you deal with it defines your character. If someone makes you feel like it does define your character, if you've taken accountability and your intentions weren't bad, they are not your friend and they were looking for a reason to condemn your character. Number 2, moral growth versus moral perfection. This is the idea of trying to make the change from this set of moral rules that you've made in your own head to focusing on growth and the acceptance of reality. So if you make a mistake, focus on how to grow from that mistake. Focus on how you deal with that mistake and your intentions rather than kicking yourself for not meeting that moral standard. As long as the mistake was unintentional, there's nothing you can do about that. It's all in how you deal with it. Number 3, looking at self-compassion as a moral act. Now, this confused me a little bit at first as well, but if you think about morality as a concept, morality is rooted in the idea that everybody is deserving of love and compassion. We strive to be moral because it allows fair and safe treatment of everybody. Right? So you're included in that. Self-compassion is a moral act because you are treating yourself fairly and respectfully. Self-love and self-compassion models moral behavior. Self-compassion and self-love disrupt that moral perfectionism cycle that causes you shame around your character. You're having these unrealistic rules for yourself, breaking them because everybody makes mistakes, having shame about that, kicking yourself and being strict with yourself again because you've made a mistake. But loving yourself provides a space for you to hold yourself accountable without the shame and without the self-hate. You can focus on growth without punishing yourself for making mistakes. Someone who is compassionate towards themselves is actually more likely to take moral responsibility. They're more likely to be accountable and therefore hold a better moral stance than someone who shames themselves and kicks themselves because they aren't overwhelmed by shame. Number 4 is recognizing the complexity and the nuance of making an ethical decision. Things are not black and white as much as people on the internet make you feel like they are. Nothing is ever black and white, and most things are debatable. Most things have substance. Most things are nuanced. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are not and that are morally bankrupt, period. And I'm sure most people are aware of what those things are. But things are never black and white, especially if you think about the psychological reasons and impacts behind it. I actually personally struggle with the pressure to be perceived as a good person. My personal goal is to realize that I actually am inherently a good person. I have good intentions, I have genuine empathy, and I care about people and things. So I think for me, positive affirmations and reminding myself that I actually am genuine, it means I don't have to do this performance because that's not going to change me being a good person, because I actually am a good person. I am genuine. That's not going to change. So why do I feel this need to perform being a good person? Why do I feel the need to push that idea onto others when I just am? It's not going to go anywhere. If your intentions are always good, as long as you have the capacity to actually take accountability when things do go wrong, then you're on the right track. Not everything's going to meet your intentions, and that's the case with literally everybody. So to finish this off, being a good person doesn't mean constantly living up to some sort of ethical standard that you've set for yourself. And it doesn't mean having to be perceived as perfect by everybody around you. Being a good person simply just means being reflective, being present, and being open to growth. So here are some questions that I'll leave with you to reflect on in terms of moral perfectionism. Why is it that you're always holding yourself to these impossible moral standards? Do you give yourself the grace that you give to others? What would it look like for you to be good enough instead of being perfect? Underneath all of the performance, do you consider yourself to be a good person? If so, why the performance? If not, it's worth looking inwards and considering why you feel that way instead of focusing on how other people are perceiving you. Thank you so much for listening to episode 6. I am Tash. This has been Things We Say in Therapy. Please share this episode with somebody that you think might benefit from this information, and comment down below anything that you think I may have missed on this topic or anything that you might find interesting that I've missed. Struggling with moral perfectionism can be really difficult, and I hope that you found something valuable from this episode. Please be kind to yourself. Please be kind to others. I'll see you again. Bye.